Tonight on Nation to Nation, Canada still hasn't paid a compensation order from the Human Rights Tribunal. It's not like Canada doesn't have the money for survivors of on-reserve child welfare.
This money that's flowing with COVID, it's really emphasized to me that it's always been possible for the Government of Canada to remedy all the inequalities that First Nations, Métis and Inuit peoples experience.
And we speak to the Member of Parliament for Nunavut, who was first elected last fall. She says her time as an MP has been a bit surreal.
And people are still coming up to me and congratulating me, saying they're so proud, saying that I'm doing a really good job.
Hello, I'm Todd Lamoran and welcome to Nation. Last October's federal election brought a surprise. 25-year-old Mumilaaq Qaqqaq won the riding of Nunavut for the NDP. But maybe not so much of a surprise, as Qaqqaq gave a memorable speech during the Daughters of the Vote event in 2017. And that drive and passion has continued as a Member of Parliament, as she has stood up in the House and at parliamentary committees defending the rights of Nunavut and Indigenous people. We reached Mumilaaq Qaqqaq in Winnipeg, and she joins me now. Welcome to Nation.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Now, you've been an MP for about 7 months, and has the novelty worn off? And what's been the biggest surprise with the job so far?
I don't think much has worn off per se. So I'm in Winnipeg in mandatory isolation. I'm going to my hometown, Baker Lake. So I've been seeing a lot of Inuit, a lot of my constituents that due to the pandemic, I haven't been able to see over the past number of weeks, and people are still coming up to me and congratulating me, saying they're so proud, saying that I'm doing a really good job. So it's words that you think you would hear for, a couple of weeks after election, that I'm definitely still getting that positivity and that encouragement from constituents, as if I just kind of won the election yesterday. So that part has been very heartwarming and very encouraging. It's been when you said 7 months, like it feels like 7 years ago and 7 days ago, all at the same time when everything happened. So since then, it's been absolutely crazy, for lack of a better word. Not very many members of parliament can say, well, the first time I was elected, we saw devastating fires in Australia. We saw President Trump making crazy statements, and there was a little bit of hums and haws of potentially World War III, and now we're facing a pandemic. And it just feels like one thing after another since the new year has started, and we're here now and working with what we can and making do with the situation that we're in.
How would you rate the government's response to the current pandemic crisis?
In the beginning, the first few weeks, it was nice to see that non-partisanship, the working with other parties and having other parties work with everyone. I think there was a lot of openness in the beginning. And as time has gone on, we've started to see the switch again, where we're going more into party opinion, if you will, as opposed to making sure that we're working for all Canadians. And we're seeing these glaring gaps for Indigenous peoples, for students, for seniors, our elders. We're seeing, and the gaps that were already there, they have been amplified. There's the spotlight on them now. And when we talk about essential services and essential workers, when we talk about grocery clerks or individuals that work at the post office, when we're talking about these positions now, we can see that they're a very important part of our society, of our economy, of making sure that people can continue their day-to-day lives. So I hope we have a new normal after this pandemic, where we see those positions getting the benefits that they should, being paid a livable wage, and being treated as they should have been, because we have proof now that we need these positions in order for our country, our territories and provinces to continue working to the best of the ability, of course, in the situation. But I think And as we have seen in the previous Liberal government as well, it's a lot of nice lip work, but not a lot of actual action. And they had announced for Nunavut, for the territory, on April 14th that they were approved for $30.8 million of the $42 million that was originally requested by the government of Nunavut. They didn't actually get that money until the beginning of last week. So it was almost a month between approval and actually receiving the money. And it just makes me wonder, how many announcements have we heard from this current and the previous Liberal government where they announced something that sounded great, but how long did it actually take for things to start happening out of that announcement?
Just to let everyone know, we're taping this interview earlier in the day. And as we're talking, having this conversation right now, the Prime Minister is announcing additional funding for off-reserve Indigenous people. So what do you think? Is it too little, too late?
I think everything is better late than never, although a lot of these requests and services that are needed in communities and for urban Indigenous peoples across the country is something that happens too late very often. My colleague Leah Gazan, Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre, has been very vocal about the need for urban Indigenous peoples and urban ridings. And if I remember correctly, it's something like less than 1% of what has been spent in direct relation to COVID-19 has gone to urban Indigenous peoples, which is absolutely mind-blowing. Like, Winnipeg is the only major city that doesn't have a safe space, a 24/7 safe space for women, children, and transgendered individuals. That is so, like, how are we in a country and we still have Indigenous peoples living in third world conditions, Indigenous peoples that are worried about their safety, don't have access to accessible housing, don't have economic development opportunities, don't have post-secondary opportunities without leaving their hometown or their community. There are so many inequalities, and we saw this before the pandemic, and unfortunately we're seeing it continue.
Ottawa, of course, has a large population of Inuit. Do you have any sense of how that community has been doing during the pandemic?
So I'm in Winnipeg in mandatory isolation. I think that the process that we have seen from the territory, from the government of Nunavut, and with the advice of Dr. Patterson, the public chief health advisor, has been really reflective of we still have no cases. So clearly the process that Nunavut are going through to get back into the territory is working, although it's not ideal. Inuit in Ottawa, we're looking at getting in touch with those members of parliament. I think some of the confusion sometimes is where you come from, where you live now, and who represents you at the federal level. So I think the observations that I have made prior to the pandemic, since being elected, is that I know there are thousands of Inuit in Ottawa, and I don't see the members of parliament that cover the Ottawa area talk with. I don't see them mention Inuit. I don't think I ever have. So it's getting in touch with them and trying to help them through that process, and just being able to, people need assistance, and people are in very difficult situations right now, and people need help. So I think that conversation is really important as well at the federal level, that people, I don't know how many members of parliament realize how many Indigenous peoples are actually in their riding. So it's trying to create those connections and collect that information to be able to pass on to other members to ensure that, people know who their representative is depending on where they live, and that their representative is responding to them and is trying to accommodate their situation.
I was there during the first Indigenous Peoples Committee when it first met months ago, and at the time you refused to participate in a blanket exercise proposed by Liberal MP Jaime Batiste. What were your reasonings for doing so?
Definitely, and I still stand by those reasons. A blanket exercise is not something that is common in Nunavut, as far as I know. The blanket exercises that I have participated in often are very specific to that area and what the situation, the historical aspect of that area is. I felt that a blanket exercise was not inclusive at all of all Indigenous groups, and often we see Inuit and Métis peoples being left out of the conversation. And to me, it needed if we were going to start off right, and this is what was being talked, we want to start in a good way, we want to start off right. Well, to me, that means either being all inclusive and making sure that we're talking about First Nations, Inuit, and Métis, or that myself and Jaime are sharing our own culture as the two Indigenous peoples on that committee. So it just felt very odd, and it felt like it was going to be a tokenized situation where it's like, oh, check, like, look at us, we did a blanket exercise. That's great, cool, maybe it's an exercise we do down the line, but my other point was that learning doesn't stop. Expanding our horizons doesn't stop. You are here as a representative for your party on the Indigenous and Northern Affairs Committee. Your learning shouldn't stop, if that makes sense. Like, with myself and Jaime being the only two Indigenous peoples, there are lots of things that we can talk about from real life experience.
Well, on that note, I want to again thank you for speaking to me.
No problem.
After the break, we'll find out why Cindy Blackstock has been caring for the gravesite of a long-dead health official. Welcome back. Over 100 years ago, Dr. Peter Henderson Bryce called it a national crime. The conditions in residential schools that were leading to illness and death. He recommended broad reforms to improve conditions at schools, but he wasn't listened to, and he died in relative obscurity. I didn't know it, but he's buried here in Ottawa. Every year his gravesite is spruced up, weeds are pulled, and new flowers planted. And it's done by a very familiar face, the Executive Director of the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society, Cindy Blackstock. She joins me now to talk about that and other things. Welcome to Nation, Ms. Blackstock.
Thank you for having me, Todd.
First of all, why is Dr. Bryce so important to you?
He's so important because he had the moral courage to say to the Government of Canada, you could save these children's lives by just providing equal health care and doing practical things like not putting sick kids in with healthy kids, making sure the buildings are well ventilated. Now, that's very familiar with it to all of us now, given the COVID situation. But he kept on speaking out even when the Government of Canada retaliated against him. And he kept on speaking to anyone who would listen to try and save these children's lives. So he's always been a constant source of inspiration as we've done our work to try and get equity before the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal.
Now, why and when did you start doing this to Dr. Bryce's final resting place?
Well, I read about him in John Malloy's book, A National Crime, which takes its title from Dr. Bryce's 1922 pamphlet about the inequities in residential schools. But I didn't realize either that he was buried in Beechwood, just a couple miles away from where I live, until the day before the apology for Prime Minister Harper for residential schools. And that day I went to the Byward Market and I brought a bouquet of brightly colored daisies because they reminded me of the brightness of kids. And I went there to his gravesite to thank him for everything that he had done. And I also thought that he published his original report in 1907, and it's kind of serendipity, if you will, that 100 years later, the Assembly of First Nations and the Caring Society filed the human rights complaint against the Government of Canada. So I told him about the case, and I told him I'd be back when the kids won.
And speaking of that, there is one photo. It's a winter photo with Spirit Bear on his tombstone saying the kids won, and a document they're stuck in the snow. What was that all about?
that was me fulfilling that promise. I had no idea that it would take so long to get the decision because Canada fought so hard. But we received the decision in an embargoed copy, probably about 4 days before everybody else in the world knew about it. And I knew I had a promise to keep. So I got my gumboots on, I got Spirit Bear, and I went down into Beechwood Cemetery in the middle of January, and I read Dr. Bryce's decision. And I remember saying, it might sound kind of corny, but I felt I needed to do it. I kind of hugged his headstone and I said, you know, justice, Dr. Bryce, finally justice.
Now, I suggested in my introduction that you kind of do this all by yourself, but that's not true. One of your pictures from this year, from just a few days ago, shows 3 other people. First of all, who are they in that picture that we're going to be showing right now?
These are the pictures of Lisa Howell, who's a teacher here in Ottawa and now getting her PhD. She's done a lot of work on reconciliation, and her daughter, Liv, and also Sylvia Smith, who is head of Project to Heart. I started doing the gardening myself. I thought a man like this needs to be remembered and honored, and it was just grass at the time. But then we worked with his family, we got a historical plaque, and then more and more people kept on coming. So the gardening group expanded.
And why is it so important to have others doing this as well alongside you?
Because it's a real honoring and learning from the past of history. It's learning about these early heroes, morally courageous heroes who stood up for kids. And we've not only done the historical plaque, we've actually worked with Project to Heart, so it's in elementary and secondary curriculum across Canada. So a lot of youth and children come to see Dr. Bryce and pay their respects, and same with residential school survivors. So it's important to us that his grave looks the best. And besides, you might not know this, Todd, I didn't know it for a while, but Dr. Bryce was a prize-winning gardener. So, you know, I don't know if our efforts are prize-winning, but we try.
Why do you think Dr. Bryce is relevant today during the COVID-19 pandemic?
Oh my gosh, I just can't stop thinking about him. You know, if he would have been listened to, if the government of Canada had addressed all those inequalities that he pointed to and implemented those reforms, not only would many of the 4,000 to 6,000 children who died during residential schools have lived, but also we would not have First Nations communities being at the top of the risk level for COVID, because those inequalities would have been addressed over 100 years ago. You know, this money that's flowing with COVID, it's really emphasized to me that it's always been possible for the government of Canada to remedy all the inequalities that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples experience. They've just chosen not to do it. And now we really need to emphasize and follow on Bryce's example and say, enough of this. You know better, do better.
You told me earlier that despite the lockdown, you're as busy as ever. What are you doing right now?
Yeah, well, we're still working on the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal case. And in fact, some of your listeners will remember that back in September, the tribunal ordered compensation to the maximum amount of $40,000 allowable under the Act to the victims of Canada's discrimination. Canada is still pursuing a judicial review of that to quash it in federal court. But at the same time, we're working to get the final order from the tribunal. So we've done the final submissions, and we're just waiting for the tribunal's final order. I hope Canada withdraws its judicial review and gives some measure of justice, especially to the children and families who have passed away waiting for justice from the Canada. But we'll have to wait and see, I guess. That's in the hands of the minister.
Now, you kind of alluded to it earlier, but how does it make you feel to see the government hand out billions of dollars almost every week while stalling on this compensation order?
Yeah, it's stalling on the compensation. It's also not being fully compliant with ending the discrimination. And it really is, to me, heartbreaking. Because, Todd, as you know, you covered this story for a long time. We're not talking about millionaires here getting disadvantaged. We're talking about little kids. And just the government of Canada treating them fairly. And I just think it is such a travesty to see that they've had the money all along and they've just chosen not to do it, dating back to the time of Bryce and continuing on today.
And what should Ottawa's priority be once things kind of get back to semi-normal?
I think that they should end the inequalities right now. I don't think we have to wait till normal. I mean, we have the Spirit Bear plan that says cost out all the inequalities First Nations experience in water, housing, healthcare, education, children's services, domestic violence services. Let's get all of that costed out and then remedy all those inequalities. They should be doing that now. They don't have to wait until the end of COVID to do it.
Now, we're hoping to get Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller on the show, our last show next week. What would you like to ask him?
I would say, you know, why is it that you've normalized these inequalities? Why haven't you addressed them? And in fact, why does the department continue to fight against equality for First Nations children? You have the answers, you have the resources, that's clear. So why are you continuing to fight? Why not just do the right thing and treat these kids as respectful and dignified and sacred human beings like they are, and give them a chance in life?
Okay, as always, it's great to talk to you. And once again, thank you for speaking to me, Cindy.
Thank you. And go check out Dr. Bryce. He's in section number 60 at Beechwood. You can visit him too.
Okay, we will try and do that very soon. Thank you.
Bye.
We'll have more after a short break. Welcome back. A slimmed-down parliament meant to debate the government's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. But one of the things that came up is the checkpoint set up by the Kanesatake Mohawks. They say it's to stop any potential infection from entering their lands. But Conservative MP Pierre-Paul Hugh wants the government to force them to remove it. Here's the whole exchange he had with Indigenous Services Minister Mark Miller.
Thank you, Chair. The Prime Minister must know that Road 344 in the Oka region is blocked by the Kanesatake Mohawks. Families in Oka are regularly caught up in these blockades that can be thrown up at any time. Is there a way for the federal government to talk with the Mohawks and bring them to reason? Minister Miller. Chair, this is not a barricade but a security checkpoint. Indigenous communities are very important, and there are road blockades, checkpoints that are set up to help the community with respect to COVID-19. And in terms of confinement, I know this raises issues in the community and outside it as well. And the Quebec Band Council and Quebec Security are in charge of the situation.
Later that same day, Minister Miller outlined his department's response to COVID-19. He said there's been 198 on-reserve cases as of 2 days ago, with 16 cases in Nunavik. Miller seemed to suggest the worst may be over, stating that 148 First Nations people have recovered, and all the Inuit cases in Nunavik the same.
This is due to incredible First Nations Inuit leadership in stomping the curve, aggressive screening, testing when cases manifest themselves in community, and the amazing work to contact trace as quick as they can when a case arises in community. And it is thanks to that aggressive action and the passage of time that these cases have recovered.
Next week is our last show of the season, and we're working on trying to get Minister Miller on for that episode. In the meantime, I hope you're keeping safe and are healthy. I'm Todd Lamoran. Thanks for watching.